This is a crazy story about a company that dragged its competitor through 10 years of litigation to stop them from opening a plant across from them. You've probably watched episodes of series like Suits, How to Get Away with Murder, Scandal, where lawyers use every aspect of the law they can to bring some advantage to themselves and to their client. This is what happened in this case. In this case, we have one company. Let's call the company Rochester. Rochester had a bituminous plant, concrete plant, in Rochester, Massachusetts. Another company, let's call them Bristol, wanted to open a plant opposite from them. Now, this was an industrial area, not a residential area. So basically, any company that wants to open a factory or a plant can open their factory or plant there. Now, Rochester sees their competitor about to open a competitive plant across from them. They decide they're not going to have that. So what do? They go to court. See, they took Bristol to court. When you want to open such plants, you have to get permits, right? And you get permits from a land board. And so when Bristol went to get their permits to open their plant, Rochester shows up to appeal. So first they appealed the approval that was given to Bristol. Their argument was that Bristol's plant would increase the noise pollution in the area. Now, these guys run the exact same business. They have the exact same plant. But they argue that these guys coming in would increase the noise pollution above the state limit. And the line board looks at it and they're like, okay, look, what you're saying is likely true, but we already considered this. If you look at the record before we approve this, by the way, Bristol had to go through 6 different public hearings before their application was approved. The court says, the board says, if you look through the record, you see that we already went through this with Bristol, and their approval is actually conditioned on making sure they have structures to limit the amount of noise increase in the area. So this is null and void, not necessary. But Rochester didn't stop that. So they went to the next step, which was they appealed the decision of the land board to the land court. Now, the land court is the first actual court. The board is an executive branch board, and there's actually a board of appeals above the land board. And they went through that, then appealed to the land court. Now, in the land court, they made another argument. Their second argument was that the second argument in the land court was that the coming of this other factory would reduce property values in the area. Now, the land court looks at this and they're like, okay, what's the evidence to this? Rochester brings evidence from a residential area close to them. And the land court dismisses this. The reason, well, a few properties may be affected, but it doesn't reach, they stated, it clearly doesn't reach the regulatory requirement that the values of the property values are reduced across board. It may reduce for a few buildings, but it doesn't reduce for buildings across the board. So they dismiss this. Now, this is something that's clear enough that I think their lawyers would have known. So allegedly, I think, my opinion is they probably knew that it was restricted to a few buildings, right? In fact, one of their executives, Rochester's executives, own some of those residential properties. So my theory is they knew that a few buildings would be affected, but not enough. But it's one way to also make sure they're still stuck in litigation. At this point, Bristol isn't allowed to run their factory yet, to open it, to even build it. So they're still stuck. Then, so they lose, Rochester loses in the land court, and so Rochester appeals. Now, they appeal to the appellate court. The appellate court looks at it and says, look, the land court is correct, so we're dismissing this, back to drawing board. But Rochester isn't done yet. Now, what they do is they wait. So Bristol goes back, and now it's been a couple of years. Their initial approval has the approval is for a few years. So their initial approval is getting to its end, And they also had approval from a conservation board to open their factory, right? So now they have to go back to the conservation board and say, it's been a couple of years, we've been stuck in litigation. Partly due to this, we need you guys to extend our approval to open our plant. And so Rochester shows up at the conservation board as well. And now they argue that the conservation board should declare the land on which Bristol wants to build a wetland. If they declare it a wetland, Bristol can build on it. The conservation board looks at it and says, guys, nothing has changed since the first, since this whole thing started. So we're not going to change the delineation. We're not going to make it a wetland. But Rochester isn't done yet. Now they go to the streets. They go to the streets and they get signatures from regular people. They ask regular people to sign a petition stating that the factory shouldn't be built and there should be conservation efforts on the land. They come back with the signatures and they're using kind of, I won't call it a loophole, it's a statutory provision called the fail-safe petition provision that allows regular people to come with enough signatures and basically make the Massachusetts Environmental Protection Agency have to look at the land and make certain delineations. Except this fail-safe provision doesn't work in this instance. So the Massachusetts Environmental Agency looks at it and they're like, guys, this clearly doesn't apply here. So we're not even going to take this seriously. We're gonna dismiss this. They don't end there. And by the way, this was in 2018. In 2020, they go collect more signatures and come back to the Environmental Protection Agency. The agency says nothing has changed again. Guys, enough with this. Nothing has changed. Take this out. And so they go back. And so at this point, Bristol has been dragged. I mean, this is like, if this was 2020 and they started this in 2010, this has been 10 years of litigation, right? And if we add the fact that this is 2023, so we can say this is 13 years of litigation. By this point, they're fed up in 2020 and they sue Rochester. They sue them for abuse of process, for anti-competitive, for restraint of trade, unfair and deceptive business practices. They take them to court. Now, Rochester shows up to court and they respond with a motion to dismiss based on the anti-SLAPP statute. The reason this is all hilarious is the anti-SLAPP statute is a statute that was created so that a big corporation cannot bully a smaller person or a smaller corporation into shutting up by threatening them with lawsuits. So the cost of lawsuits are enough of a threat. If someone wants to shut you up, all they need to do is file a lawsuit. It's gonna cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend, many years to defend, and that alone makes people cower, right? You don't want to go through all those years and waste so much money. Rochester claims that Bristol is trying to silence them, basically, that Bristol is using the law to try to silence them. Ironic, based on what has been happening so far. The court looks at this and the court is like, yeah, they're not going to accept that motion to dismiss. The case moves forward. So Rochester then appeals the case to the appeals court. And here we are. So the case documents we're looking at right now are the appeals court case. The appeals court looks at it and states, guys, it's ridiculous. So they say, Rochester's petition, this is the appeals court now, has no reasonable factual support or any arguable basis in law. It's a waste of time. And they were agreeing with the land court, by the way. So the real decision was that there is no abuse of discretion by the land court. The land court made the right decision. And the reason they think so is because Rochester's petitions had no reasonable factual support or any arguable basis in law. Quote, it was a sham petition, and so dismissal was appropriate. And so they dismissed it. So here we are, 13 years later, not even 10 years. Bristol has gone through all this crap, and hopefully now they are able to build that plant. Or are they?